Good morning. Welcome to the Point. It has been another explosive week in Washington, and we sat down with one of your congressmen, Bill Huizenga from the Lakeshore, to talk about his perspective of what's happening in D.C. I start almost every show these days by saying we talked earlier in the week because by Sunday morning, who knows what the latest incarnation will be from Washington. But for today, right now, the firing of James Comey as the FBI Director has captivated people around this country. It has become a political firestorm, or should I say, the continuation of a political firestorm for the Trump administration. Give me your take on this firing and the timing of it.
Well, and first of all, the question is how extensive and wide is that interest? Is it media and the Twitterverse? The keyboard commandos that are out there represent obviously an element of the population, but how deep does this go? I think is a legitimate question. Nonetheless, as James Comey had said in his own letter to the FBI employees, he believed that the president has the ability to do this. He doesn't want more to be read into it than what there is. I agree with him. The timing, though, frankly, Rick, I think is frustrating for somebody like me because you have to question what kind of advice is he getting? Who's telling him that we think this is a good idea? Now, granted, there's a no-win situation here. If he had waited till after he met with the Russians, he would have had this charge of somehow they told him to go do this by the conspiracy theorists. If he had done this immediately after he had been sworn in, people would say, "Oh, look, he's running from it." Then, and look, the hypocrisy that is out there from Nancy Pelosi, Maxine Waters, Bernie Sanders, so many others that had demanded that he be fired prior to the election. And now they're suddenly his largest defenders. I think they just look foolish.
What does this investigation look like? What should it look like? And is there any there? Because the longer we go with less and less information, it is a natural assumption. It's what people do. They fill in the blanks for themselves. So doesn't the president have a vested interest in getting this investigation thoroughly vetted and out before the public, particularly if there's nothing there?
Well, there's three investigations going on. One, you have the FBI looking into what had been happening, and James Comey there or James Comey not there, that investigation is still going on. In the House, just yesterday, Jason Chaffetz, the chairman of the Oversight and Government Reform Subcommittee, requested that the Inspector General, the IG, at the FBI expand into this particular area regarding Director Comey. You've got the Senate Intelligence Committee on a bipartisan basis with Richard Burr moving forward, asking Comey to come back in and testify this coming week on Tuesday. So, I mean, there's I believe an adequate amount of eyes being put on this, and as the Speaker had said as well, we need to let the facts lead us where they lead, and I'm completely comfortable with that. Let the process go through. I think everybody needs to sort of step back, though, from the hyperbole here a little bit and take a deep breath and allow the process to move forward. So they're not trying to pronounce judgment on things that they don't even have facts about. So that's really where we're at yet.
Does all of this seem eerily familiar? I mean, the first 100+ days of this administration seems to have had one exclamation point after another after another. I mean, nothing seems any more settled in Washington today than it did on Inauguration Day, or is that a false perception?
Well, I think we've been moving forward, though, and been making some progress in the House, certainly with the bill of the passage on the repeal of the Affordable Care Act and what we're trying to replace it with, and I'm sure we'll want to talk about that here in a minute or two. You look at what's been happening on the foreign policy side. Certainly a number of things have been happening. Syria, North Korea, Middle East. There's a lot of people that felt we had a positive response for the first time, or maybe a clear response for the first time in Syria with this president. Certainly what he's done with the executive orders and what he's been able to do to sort of rein in the regulation nation that we've become has been, I think, some positive steps. We need to get into the tough nitty-gritty, though, of the legislative process, and that's what we're trying to do. We've done that with health care in the House. Let's get it going in the Senate. We need to start tackling tax reform. That's been ongoing, but that's going to become more to the front and public. DoddFrank, something that our committee had worked with our Choice Act, which is a response to Dodd-Frank, is ongoing. So we've got some other pretty big lifts that we are doing in the meantime as well.
Well, does Donald Trump and his continuing upheaval with whatever the next step is help or hinder that process?
Yeah, that is a challenge when you get sort of pulled off in different directions. The question is the House and the Senate going to be able to continue to do its job? The answer to that is yes. I mean, we're able to focus in. We're still going to move along on health care, for example. Vice President Pence, who got intimately involved on the House side, is going to be intimately involved on the Senate side. So I don't think it helps. Certainly, it pulls messaging off for those of us trying to push the legislative agenda. But look, Donald Trump is not a conventional politician by any stretch of the imagination. A lot of people here in the United States believe that is still a good thing, and that process, as we had been going along for the last 8 years, just simply wasn't working the way it had been promised, and we needed to go in a different direction. So he definitely delivers on that. With 140 characters, and your day may change, and your day may change as well.
As it has many times. Let's talk about health care. Health care was passed predictably without a single Democratic vote. 20 Republican colleagues said they didn't want to vote for it either. It's over in the Senate. One of your colleagues who had an input on that was Congressman Fred Upton from the southwest part of the state. And he told me immediately after that vote that, look, this isn't the bill that's going to pass. It's going to go over to the Senate. They're going to write their own bill, go to a conference committee. What was in the bill you passed? And then let's talk about what it may look like later. But first, what's there?
Yeah, well, first of all, we have to acknowledge the fact that Obamacare, the ACA, is failing. We just heard this past a week ago, we heard that Aetna was pulling out of 94 of the 99 counties in Iowa. They announced this week that they are eliminating all of their involvement in the exchanges. In the ACA. We hear this happening in Wisconsin, we hear it happening in Virginia, all over the place where there had been this promise of lower premiums, lower deductibles, lower costs overall, with greater access. It hasn't happened. So we had to go in and address that. And for someone like myself, where I think that there are some positive elements to what was happening, we need to kind of preserve those. Going back to where we had been prior to the ACA, in my mind, is not success. That was not working there either. The problem was the ACA wasn't the answer. What we did in the House is we tried to empower patients and providers and healthcare deliverers, get them involved and engaged, get the states more involved and engaged. I think it was a mistake on the front end to offer to the states the fact that they could have 100% of the costs of someone being added to the Medicaid rolls in the state, who is able-bodied, working age, no children. So we're not talking about putting children at risk or single moms or anything like that. Able-bodied working adults with no children, adding them and paying 100% of that. Yet while the reimbursement for someone who is disabled is national average is 57%. Well, I've sat in Lansing, and your three largest expenditures when you're sitting in the state government is education, corrections, and Medicaid. And what we did is we just ended up putting a longer-term burden on these states. They took it for a shorter-term burden, or shorter-term benefit, I should say. So we have to address that, have to get the states more involved and engaged. It gives the governors much more flexibility as they're going in and saying, okay, let's make these programs work for our folks. Let's make sure that when we're dealing here in Michigan versus Mississippi, two states that the only thing that they really have in common is the letter M, is how do you make those systems work in each of those states? And having this national sort of blanket coverage is the wrong direction. And I disagree with the folks that are showing up at some of the town hall meetings who believe that having a national run healthcare system is the way to go. I think that pulls providers out, it pulls us as patients out, it pulls the states out, and that's the wrong direction to go.
The people who oppose and with a loud voice opposed this bill that was passed by the House say 24 million people will lose insurance, that pre-existing conditions will no longer be accepted for insurance policies. And in fact, this does allow, in certain cases, for waivers for states to take some of that responsibility back. And so it would leave at least part of that, if I understand it, up to those governors of those individual states. And obviously, as members of Congress, you can't necessarily tell those governors what to do if they get that waiver. So those things are very concerning to people who may have health insurance for the first time under the ACA.
So let's start with the first that first charge that you hear out there. And where they get that number from is the Congressional Budget Office review of the original bill. So first of all, the original bill, it says that scoring, that 14 million people will choose in the first year to not buy insurance that they would have been forced to buy in the first place. So it's really an apple and oranges comparison there. Then it assumes that every state is going to sort of maximize this and try to move people off as many as they can. That's why you saw people trying to protect the pre-existing condition side of things, trying to make sure that people that had coverage had a better opportunity to have that coverage. But as you look at like what happened in Iowa, great. So you've got people in 94 counties that have an insurance card, but they don't have an insurance provider. So having a card and having access really are two different things. So, how do we move forward and acknowledge the realities of what the ACA has been doing? The flexibility that we are trying to give states is to say, okay, there's certain things that you can't touch. So pre-existing conditions is one of those. They come up with this very convoluted sort of backwards way. Well, if you didn't have coverage and you voluntarily chose to not have coverage for 63 months, if you then had a state that had granted a waiver requesting this, if you were in that individual or marketplace pool, which by the way is 7% of all of the people covered under insurance, 93% are covered under their employer yet, then you might have the opportunity to be denied coverage. Well, and that's what Fred Upton tried to get at and others tried to get at. We put $130 billion into this transition fund for states to figure out what they're going to do with folks like that. Fred upped that by another $8 billion, specifically geared towards people with pre-existing conditions. So we feel like we've adequately covered the sort of realistic things that are going to happen. You've got people sort of spinning yarns and scenarios that, if it was, 2 blue moons in a month and 5 Wednesdays, then this might happen. Well, we just don't see the governors doing that, and certainly our governor has said he's not going to do that.
I don't want to spend much more time on this, and we've got to take a break, but I have to ask this. More than 50 times, you and your colleagues voted to repeal all or some of the Affordable Care Act.
Yep.
In this second bill, it wasn't scored by the CBO, and I get it. The CBO doesn't necessarily have a magic wand.
Can I say that? Yeah. It was still the original bill. It was still the same underlying bill, and there was 3 amendments. There was an amendment by a guy named Gary Palmer and Dave Schweikert, which got into the state flexibility. Then a guy, Tom MacArthur, who I serve with on the Financial Services Committee, his amendment, by the way, was 8 pages. And then Fred Upton's amendment, which was 3 pages. So when people are saying, how could you possibly digest this? The underlying bill was 128 pages, which I read. The amendments were dozens of pages, which I read. And this is not a scenario what Nancy Pelosi had laid out with the original ACA of we have to pass this to find out what's in it. Look, we know what we were intending to do in this bill. Now we're depending on the White House and Secretary Price, more specifically, who has in 1,300 spots in the ACA where it says the Secretary shall or the Secretary may rule and figure out what those rules are. We're really trying to empower him to also make this system work.
What's the rush?
Well, what's the rush, Rick, is the system's failing. We're seeing this with announcements from Aetna that they're pulling out. We're hearing this all over the country. I had somebody here locally at the Granville Chamber. This was the Monday after the original attempt, and when we didn't take up that bill on that Friday. Flew home. I got to tell you, I was feeling very frustrated. Wasn't sure that the Republicans were going to be able to demonstrate that we could govern. And I had this breakfast on that Monday morning here in Granville. And I got up there and I'm like, I'm not sure what I'm going to tell you or what I'm supposed to tell you, because it feels a little like I'd be telling you what I'd be doing with my lottery winnings had I played the lottery. And what do we do? And this woman said to me, she said, I don't have time, no offense, but I don't have time to go to your town hall meetings. I'm trying to run my own small business here and get health care for myself and my son. And we talked to her later, and she was a single mom. And she said, I can't afford this. My premiums have tripled, my deductibles have doubled. I'm looking at like $18,000 that this is going to cost me next year, and I can't afford this. So you have got to go back and do something about it. And I told her, I said, you know what, I'm glad I came this morning, literally just for that story and for her example and for her situation. And I went back, and that next morning I shared it in our conference with what she was telling me. And I think that's why, that's the urgency. That's why we have to move forward on this, to figure out a workable solution. Sometimes when you're trying to do something great, sometimes you just have to do something. Well, we did that. We got some movement on this coming out of the House. The Senate's going to do what the Senate does. That's great. That's the constitutional legislative process. We'll review whatever they come back with. My suspicion is that it won't be accepted as is in the House, and we'll have to go to some sort of conference committee where the White House, through whether it's Vice President Pence and Secretary Price and others, they're going to have their involvement as well. But we have to figure this out for the American people.
And it's not just about Comey and health care. There's more to come next. To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. We're talking with Republican Congressman Bill Huizenga from the Lakeshore about what's going on in Washington and what he'd like to see happen next. Tax reform, something that's been talked about in Washington for a very long time. How do you deal with tax reform when you still have that trillions of dollars worth of debt sitting over there?
Yeah, well, that has to be acknowledged. We're just shy of $20 trillion in debt, and I go and speak to a lot of school groups as well, and kids kind of go, 10 trillion, 20 trillion, $10, $20, what's the big difference, right? And I have them write out a 1 with 12 zeros behind it, and I have them not work from the left, but work from the right. And you see $1,000, you see $10,000, you see $100,000. You can see these kids kind of, it's making some sense, and you start hitting millions and billions, and by the end of it, they're like, whoa, wait a minute, what are you guys doing to us here? So we're not going to get there overnight, that is for sure. But one of the key to reform that, it's going to have to be short-term, medium-term decisions and long-term decisions. But one of the things we do know, Rick, is one of the best things that we can possibly do is get the economy going. Not this, 1.8%, 2.1% kind of economic growth. We're talking real robust growth of, now we're 4% would be great. I'd settle for 3%. We can't become Europe. We can't allow our economy to become Europe and have those sort of anemic growth rates, because then we are really in the soup at that point. It's a couple of things. One, it's regulation. That doesn't get talked about as much, but we really have become regulation nation over the last 8 years, and we've got to make sure that we are focused on returning a balance and getting some reasonableness, whether it's the EPA, whether it's the Securities and Exchange Commission, whether it's Department of Energy, whatever it might be. We've got to make sure that there's some reasonableness to it. But tax reform is a key element to that. Even President Obama had talked about that. He wanted to move from a 35% corporate tax rate to 25%. The House had suggested a 20%. The Trump administration has come in with a 15%. Whether it's 15, 20, we couple that up with regulation, reform, we can really get our economy going again. And that is the key, putting people back to work. Then we don't have people needing to draw on social welfare programs nearly as much. They're able to make decisions about their retirement. They're able to make decisions about their health care. They're able to do so many things if we can just make sure that we have a robust economy. Tax reform has got to be a part of that.
And you can hear your colleagues across the aisle saying, look, all they're doing is helping the guy that's rich. They're helping big business. They're helping those people become richer because that tax reform, changing the business tax, doesn't help the guy that's on.
Yeah, you know what the problem is that their argument falls short when you see Wall Street doing just fine, but Main Street really struggling. And we still see that. We have got to get relief into that middle class, those hard-earning taxpayers, hard-working taxpayers that are earning every buck. And are frustrated that they feel like there's no respect coming out of their government when they send those taxes in. We've got to make sure that small businesses especially, which typically are structured under either an LLC, limited liability corporation, or a subchapter S corporation, where all of that income flows through to their personal income tax. So theoretically, they make $100,000 on their business. Well, they take out $50,000, and they're trying to save that other $50,000 for a piece of equipment or hiring new people or maybe remodeling their store. Oh, but out of that $50,000 that they're saving, they now have to pay tax on $100,000. So $25,000 of that is suddenly gone. So they made quote unquote made $100,000 on their personal income tax. They spent $25,000 of that on taxes. Took $50,000 home and are trying to save and build for the future with that other remaining dollars. So how do we treat them the same way that President Obama wanted to do, which was a big giant C corporation that would see its corporate tax rates lowered? That seems to me about equity and fairness, to make sure that entrepreneurs and small business owners are going to have the same chance that a big giant corporation that can afford all these lobbyists and tax policy experts and all those kinds of things, make sure that they have a voice as well. And that's the bread and butter of West Michigan. That really is.
Running out of time, I want to talk to you about this because I know you've been focusing on this a lot. DoddFrank, the regulation that you say, along with a lot of your Republican colleagues say, needs to go away. Where are you with that, and what's the alternative?
Yeah, well, we have to acknowledge that our recovery here in the economy has been one of the slowest, shallowest recoveries in the modern era. DoddFrank has been a significant part of that, and how they've been dealing with banks and credit unions. And I'm not talking the big Wall Street banks. I'm talking our local folks, our community banks, our credit unions. This week I've spent time with both of those, and they're desperate because they know that it affects their customers. So when folks are trying to get a mortgage or a car loan, student loans, all of those things are being affected by DoddFrank. And the question is, has it made our banking system and our financial system safer? There's some things that had slid through the cracks. But guess what? Most of those things had rules in place and regulators in place that failed. Those regulators failed to catch what had caused our downturn last time. And so we need to re-emphasize those. So it's not this idea that with our Financial Choice Act that we just passed out of committee this past week, that somehow there's not going to be any regulation or any regulators. That simply isn't the case. The question is how do we make sure that the cops on the beat, those regulators, are doing the things that we hired them to do? Not to continue with the analogy, not be out there filling potholes and checking streetlights. That's not their job. They need to be policing the system. And DoddFrank really pulled them away from that. So, big things like reforming the Federal Reserve, the FORM Act, one of my past bills was part of this. Looking at how we're going to deal with the Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection, which has really been out of control. How do we make sure that regulators are doing their job, but allowing for growth to happen in our economy? That's the idea.
Completely out of time.
Yep.
Does that kind of legislation require 60 votes over in the Senate, or can you do it with a simple majority?
Yeah, no, it is a 60 vote. There's parts of it that that could use a simple majority if we are able to use the budget reconciliation. We're using the first budget reconciliation for healthcare. The next budget reconciliation we could use for things like financial services reform. We'll also start, peeling off pieces of our Financial Choice Act and working on those individual elements. There's a lot of bipartisan support, actually, for what we're trying to do in it. And so I'm looking forward to working on that.
We're back with more To the Point in just a moment. The divide in Washington has never been much more clearly defined between Republicans and Democrats. And going forward, despite what Congressman Huizenga said about bipartisan support for some issues, it may be hard to come to consensus on some of those really, really big issues, healthcare, for example. And we know that there's a different view from the Democratic side of the aisle, and we'll be featuring that in an upcoming show. We hope you'll join us every Sunday morning right here, 10 o'clock